Greetings, Missouri Mid-South Conference. I bring you greetings from my conference office where I've returned after Labor Day weekend. I hope that your Labor Day weekend was filled with rest and also prophetic awareness for those who labor for living wage as our ancestors and those of us and our neighbors today. Last week I had a wonderful opportunity to have an interview and conversation with Jim Keats from the Center for Progressive Renewal, and it was live streamed on Facebook video. And he wanted to have a conversation with different leaders of different denominations about what trends they see in church growth and in Christianity in general. As I was preparing for that conversation, which went in a lot of wonderful different directions, I began to ask myself and reflect on what are the trends? What is it that I see and experience as a church that is vital, that is dynamic, that has energy, that one might describe as growth? I will be the first to say that I don't like the language of growth because it puts our focus too much on numbers, rather than growth, as I understand it, is that deepening and that rootedness where we are growing deeper in our relationships with one another, in our relationship with God, and in who has called us to be. And churches often are growing, even though their membership may or may not reflect that numerically. As I began to think about the churches in the Missouri Mid-South Conference that have that kind of energy and that kind of deepening in relationship and purpose, I identified 3 different characteristics that I want to share with you because I think it's important to name and honor and celebrate that we do have churches and communities. The first characteristic of a dynamic church is hospitality. A church that is welcoming. Before I became your conference minister, in that in-between time, after I had resigned as pastor and before I started, I worshiped in different places. And the most shocking part of being in a church and visiting a church was how inhospitable the church community was. Now, I'm a huge church nerd. I love church. I love everything about church, from the parking lot to the signs to the website to the worship, and what are the unique qualities of this congregation. And what I learned very quickly in that in-between time is that churches tend to focus within, focus on themselves. And if there's a visitor that they might acknowledge and they might not. In fact, there was one time when I was worshiping somewhere and a member actually said to me, "You're sitting in my place." And it was so shocking that I got up and I felt chastised, and it did alter the way that I worship. Our churches that are dynamic are welcoming. They have thought through every detail of a visitor before the visitor even fathoms coming to their church. From what is it like to go on the website and look for information, obvious information, on the web page. On the first thing that we should see is the worship time and the address of the church and a note of welcome, to the point of driving into the parking lot. When I get out of my car, what signs tell me which door to go in? Even as your conference minister, sometimes this trips me up as well. Do I go into the obvious front door of the church? But the hidden rules may be that everybody knows you don't go through the front door, you go through the side door. But there aren't any signs that tell me that. To The signs of welcome in terms of if there are children and families with children, if there are persons with different needs, to the worship service itself. What are the hospitable, welcoming ways that we say, you are wanted and we are glad that you are here? A dynamic church has thought through that and is aware and makes sure that there are those spaces in making wide the welcome for all. I'll say that in my previous church, I often had people who would say to me that they did a dry run of coming to the church just to make sure that they were at the right place, especially because in their situations they were nervous and anxious about coming to this church because they hadn't been in church for a long time, and when they had been in church, they had received a message of exclusion. You're not good enough, you're not worthy enough, you're not welcomed. Our churches should be welcoming. The second characteristic of a dynamic church is that churches are generous. The members are generous. And of course, the first part of that I'm going to say is financial. There is a financial generosity of members who want and yearn to give because they believe that the church in which they are giving, they are making a difference. I can't tell you how significant this is. I am so appreciative of the generosity of members and churches and people. It's when people in churches know that they are making a difference, that they want to give of their money. But it's also the generosity of leadership and of the governing body, the church council, if you will. Sometimes we all have those moments where we have to tighten our belt and we have to be responsible. And even in those moments of what may feel like scarcity, there is energy of generosity, discerning what limited resources that a church has. A church council will say, we are going to put our money here. We are going to invest our money with our children, with our youth, with our social justice and missions, with our conference in our church's wider mission. It can be in all of those ways, but churches I have observed that are dynamic in quality are generous, and members see it, feel it, sense it, and it's invigorating and it's contagious. And members want to give in a way that makes that member and that church generous. Finally, the third characteristic of a dynamic church is a church that is willing to take risks, courageous. A church that gets to that point where they are facing what may feel like this huge cliff, and faced with that decision, do I turn back and do what is comfortable and do what I know is safe and do what I know will cause the least amount of conflict, tension, and disruption? Or do I take that leap that we spiritual folks call faith, but that leap of risk and courage to try something new, to do something new, to offer something new in a way that is dynamic? Churches today that are willing to be courageous with their ministries, with their members, with their church in the community, when they are willing to take risks, there is no stopping them. I have to say that we have a number of courageous churches. We have a number of welcoming churches. We have a number of generous churches, and that's why I believe, and I'm so excited to be your conference minister, because we are a dynamic conference with dynamic churches. The last caveat that I would offer that is kind of the underlying presence in all of these qualities is that all of these qualities are done not for themselves, but for others, for the community, and specifically for the underserved in their community. It could be the homeless, it could be LGBTQ youth, it could be the poor, it could be the immigrants, undocumented workers who are here in our community. Who are the underserved in our community? And then the church and the members of that church and the friends of that church have this dynamic quality of being hospitable and welcoming, being generous beyond imagination, and willing to take risks, even and especially when that means that we are courageous in our local communities as and being known as that church. The question that I would invite you to consider today is, who are the underserved in your community? Who are the ones who were forgotten by the government, by the schools, by the businesses, and by the churches? And how is God calling you and your local church to make a difference, to make sure that that underserved person or population knows that they are welcomed with a generosity of spirit and financial and leadership opportunities, and is willing to take risks to embrace and offer Christ's love to all, especially the underserved? That, my friends, is the quality, the characteristics of a dynamic church. When we are aware and in tune with who are the underserved in our community. I am grateful this day for so many of you who take seriously that responsibility as we are welcoming of all, generous of all, and indeed, in this moment in time and space, willing to take risks for all, this day and forevermore. Amen.